All right, so we are making our way through Unit 3 of Jews, Israel, and Jesus. And Unit 3 is God's purpose for his people and Israel's need for Messiah. So we have learned so far in this unit that God's original design and desire was to have one big human family that would fill the earth, that he could pour his love and blessing out upon as they stayed in fellowship with him and worshiped him for all eternity. But all the way back to Adam and Eve, mankind has messed that up. And so the generations went on, and that led all the way to the violence and the wickedness and destruction that God had to bring the flood and restart over with Noah and say again to Noah, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth with people that I can bless. But then those generations went on to become nations, and they didn't want to worship God. They wanted to make a name for themselves instead. And so they built the Tower of Babel to try to access heaven and make a name for themselves rather than worshiping God. And so God had to scatter them to the ends of the earth and change their languages. And it looked totally hopeless because no one in the world worshiped the one God who had created the whole world and everything in it. But out of that hopelessness where no one was worshiping him, God called Abram. And he made a promise to Abram. God was determined to bless all the peoples of the earth, all the nations of the earth. So he chose Abram and he said, obey me, and through your seed I will bless. I will make you into a blessing. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. And then we went through and understand how Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel became the nation of Israel. And we've been looking at how the people of Israel, instead of obeying God and keeping his commandments so that God could make his name famous in all the earth and fulfill his desire and his design to bless all the peoples of the earth by bringing them back into relationship with him, the way he was going to do that was by showing himself mighty on behalf of his people, but also showing himself to be good and righteous and just and true through the way that his people conducted themselves. But once the people received the promised land, they decided they wanted to be like all the other nations of the earth. They didn't want God to be their king and obey him. Instead, they wanted a human king to be like all the other nations. And that's where we've gotten ourselves to as we pick up at point 4 of section D of unit 3. So now we're up to the part where we've got Israel as a kingdom. And right now we're going to talk about Israel when it was a united kingdom. That's Saul, David, and Solomon. And during that time, the temple of God was built in the city of Jerusalem. So we'll start with King Saul. Now, Saul was handsome in outward appearance, and he was tall. He was a head taller than everyone else. But Saul had some issues. He feared the people, and he feared enemy nations more than he feared the Lord. And therefore, he disobeyed God's command. He offered unauthorized sacrifices. He consulted with a medium who spoke to the dead on his behalf rather than consulting with the Lord. And he erected a monument of false worship rather than glorifying God. Now, when you understand that God's purpose for his people is to reveal his holiness, his righteousness, his goodness, his character, his nature, and his power, and then you've got a king who is bowing down to the other powers, bowing down to other gods, well, this is not going to put the power and goodness of God on display for anyone to come to worship the God of Israel. So you've got to understand that God is not just punishing Saul and taking his kingdom away because Saul made a few mistakes here and there. No, God's purpose cannot be fulfilled if the king, the ruler of his people, is leading the people in rebellion and false worship of other gods. So let's look at the scriptures pertaining to Saul and his life and how this all happened. Starting in 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upwards, he was taller than any of the people. So from a human perspective, Saul, he was the right choice for king. Yeah, we want the tall guy. We want the good looking guy. We want that guy to be our king. That's a guy I can really put my confidence in. See, this is the way that humans think. Back then and even to this day, it's a very common thing. Good-looking people, yeah, that's going to bring us success, of course. So God met them in their expectation. They wanted a human king. He gave them what humans think is important. However, Saul disobeyed, and God then rejected him as king of his people. So let's look at 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verses 13 to 14. So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore, the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So again, God was looking for someone who would lead his people in obedience to his commandments. Why? So that the people would reveal the goodness of God, and also, if they obeyed God, then God could pour out his blessing upon his people, and then the blessing and the power and the goodness of God would be plain for all the world to see that the God of Israel is the Most High God. But the fact that Saul is off consulting with a medium, this is not going to lead the people into the blessing of God through their obedience. It's leading the people in rebellion and anarchy against God. And so the Lord put Saul to death and turned the kingdom over to David. Let's look at some other scriptures about Saul. 1 Samuel 13:14. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So I hope you're starting to see God is not mean or unjust. God needs obedience in order to fulfill his purpose for his people, but even more than that, through his people to the rest of the nations of the earth. And see God's heart. This is now 1 Samuel chapter 15, 11 to 12. See God's heart in this. God was saddened about what happened with Saul. He says, I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning. And it was told Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself, and turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. So Saul was leading the people in rebellion against God, which would not allow God to pour out his blessing to his people so that he could be made famous in all the earth. Instead, if the people of God are not blessed, then why is anyone going to want to follow their God? Well, that's what God was preventing by taking the kingdom away from Saul and handing it over to David, who would be a man after his own heart. Now, David was called to be king of Israel when he was still a shepherd boy. He was unimpressive in appearance, not like Saul. Saul was good looking. David was beautiful but ruddy. He was just a boy when he was called to be king. But he was a man after God's own heart. And he started to make God famous when he defeated Goliath, the giant. And he knew that the defeat of Goliath was to make God's name renowned in all the earth, so that all the earth would know that the God of Israel was the Most High God, and all the earth would want to worship the God of Israel. But David also, he knew the mercy of God, because David, he made his fair share of mistakes. David was an adulterer, a murderer. He had created schemes to hide his sin. But when it came time for David to confess his sin and come to the fact that he had sinned against God, he repented earnestly from the heart. David understood God's purpose to make a name for himself, but David also understood the mercy of God, the heart of God for people, slow to anger, abounding in mercy and steadfast love for people. And David relied upon this mercy for himself. David wanted God to be exalted in the sight of all the nations of the earth. And David wanted to build a temple for the Lord so that all the nations could come to the people of God and worship the God of Israel. But David, as a man of war, through the wars and through the battles that God gave David victory in, David made God famous time and time and time again. But at the same time, because of that, David had shed much blood. And God did not want people coming to worship at his temple to worship a God of bloodshed and violence. So instead, he said to David, "No, you cannot build a temple for me. Instead, your son, I will raise up a son after you. He will be a man of peace and rest." Because God wanted original design all the way back to Eden. Man was created on the sixth day, and on the first day of man's existence, guess what? God rested. He rested, and man entered into the rest of God. Eden was supposed to be easy. God's design was rule and reign over the earth. Enjoy this abundance and the beautiful creation that I have created for you and given to you and given you authority over, and rest with me. Have peace with me. Settle into this creation and enjoy it. So God was going to raise up someone other than David so that all the nations could come and worship God, who brings peace and security and blessing to all the nations of the earth. So let's look at the scriptures pertaining to these matters and David's life. So starting with 1 Samuel chapter 16. But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And that was speaking about the Lord seeing the heart of David, and that David would be a man after his own heart. Well, only about a chapter later, 1 Samuel 17, David, as a teenage boy, already anointed to be the next king of Israel, he goes out and boldly understands the purpose of God so that the whole world will come to know the God of Israel. This, of course, is David's confrontation of Goliath, the giant. This is 1 Samuel 17, starting with verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." So you see, Saul was rejected for his breach of faith. He didn't trust God. When the going got tough, and even when Saul stood in battle against the Philistines, Saul consulted with a medium. Saul offered sacrifices that weren't sanctioned. He disobeyed God because of his fear of the enemy. But now David comes along. He's not afraid. "No, I'm not afraid of your sword and your spear. I come to you in the name of the God of Israel, whom you have defied." Continuing on, verse 46, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth." Here it is, "so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." So there again, all the earth will know that the God of Israel is the most powerful God, and so that all the people of Israel will know the Lord saves people who put their trust in him. God's purpose is for all nations to come to know him through his people, Israel. Well, God went on to give David victory after victory after victory in his early years, in his middle years, in his later years. The fame of David, this is what 1 Chronicles 14:17 says, "The fame of David went out into all lands, and the Lord brought the fear of him upon all nations." So do you see that? God is letting David become famous because David is glorifying God. David understands that God's purpose is to make a name for himself so that all of humanity can be restored to relationship with him. And David really demonstrates this in the story where he brings the Ark of the Covenant into Zion, into the city of Jerusalem. David sings a song, and he sings with all his heart. But in this song, it makes it plain that God's purpose is to be known in all the earth. So let's take a look at this. This is 1 Chronicles chapter 16, starting with verse 23. Sing to the Lord, all the earth. Tell of his salvation from day to day. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. You see it right there. All the earth, all the nations, all the peoples. God wants to be known as the only God in all creation so that he can bless the people and all people are restored to him. David goes on in his song of praise, verse 25, "For great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised, and he is to be feared above all gods. For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Splendor and majesty are before him. Strength and joy are in his place. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength." So David is saying, remember, the blessing to Abraham was that all families of the earth would be blessed through Abraham. David is now saying, families of the earth, give worship to God, the worship that he deserves. The God of Israel is more powerful than any other God. He is the one who created it all. He goes on, verse 29, "Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Yes, the world is established, and it shall never be moved. Let the heavens be glad, and the earth rejoice. And let them say among the nations, the Lord reigns." David's heart is God's heart. Let all the earth praise the Lord, so that all the earth can be restored to the blessing and to fellowship with God. And David wanted to build a temple so that all the nations would have a place to come and worship the God of Israel. But God said to David, "No, you are not the one that will build the temple for me, for you have shed too much blood." And David shares this with Solomon, his son, the one who is going to build the temple for his name. So let's look at that scripture. 1 Chronicles 22, starting with verse 7. David said to Solomon, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed too much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever." So God did not want the house associated with his name, the temple, his holy temple, to be associated with war and bloodshed. God was going to establish his temple for his people in a time of peace and security and abounding blessing. God makes a name for himself as the Most High God. Yes, the all-powerful God. Yes, that is his reputation. But he uses that power to bring peace and righteousness and holiness and justice. That is God's purpose. And it was Solomon who would build the temple for the name of the Lord. So when the kingdom passed from David to Solomon, God was made famous in all the earth because Solomon asked for wisdom and God gave it to him. Solomon's wisdom and wealth surpassed all the kings of all the other nations, and therefore people from every nation came to hear the wisdom of Solomon and to experience the wealth of the people of Israel. It it begins to look like the times in accordance with the promise of the law. If you obey me, these blessings will come upon you and overtake you, and all the nations, you will be raised up in fame in the sight of all the nations. It looks like the blessing of God upon his people is starting to happen in the days of Solomon, and God is making a name for himself so that all the nations are seeking out the God of Israel. So let's take a look. 1 Kings chapter 4, starting with verse 29. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand of the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and reptiles and fish, and the people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So you see there, all the peoples and all the kings are coming to hear the great wisdom that God has given to Solomon. They're saying the God of Israel must be God for them to have such a wise king. And that's exactly what the Queen of Sheba said. The Queen of Sheba was overwhelmed by the abundant blessing and the wisdom that she saw in the kingdom of Israel and the king who was Solomon. So this is the Queen of Sheba speaking. This is now 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 9. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, so that you may execute justice and righteousness. So the Queen of Sheba, she did exactly the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 4 that we talked about in a prior unit as being God's purpose for his people obeying his commands and laws. Moses had said to them, obey the commands so that the people of the nation say, what kind of people is this? And what kind of God do they have that their righteousness and their justice is so perfect and so kind and gracious, and the way they treat one another? Wow, God loves his people. The Queen of Sheba perceived it perfectly. But let's keep going. The Queen of Sheba wasn't the only one. 1 Kings chapter 10, starting with verse 23. Thus Solomon excelled all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put into his mind. So the whole earth, this is God's design. Yes, God's purpose to bless all the nations through his people, and now all the nations are coming to hear the wisdom that the God of Israel has given to his people. And also because of this, God expanded the territory of Israel wider than it had ever been. It still wasn't the fulfillment of the full promise that God had made to Abraham, but the borders of Israel expanded wide during the times of Solomon as king. This is 2 Chronicles chapter 9, starting with verse 26. And he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Shephelah. So God blessed his people so much that, again, the promise of the blessing, you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. When God's people were obeying him, God poured out his blessing and raised them up in the earth and gave them authority and dominion over other nations, a wide territory, because the God of Israel was blessing his people and making himself known through his people to all the rest of the earth. And it was in the days of Solomon that Solomon built the temple for God. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, Moses had said, when you get into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, God is going to select one place in all the earth where he will accept sacrifices from his people. And Moses goes on to say that you can't just offer sacrifices anywhere you want. No, the God of Israel has one place that he has selected in all the earth, and in that place, that is where he will accept sacrifices to his name. That's where he will make his name. That's where he will make his habitation among his people. And so David had been the one that place was revealed to. He had purchased the place where the temple was going to be built. He made all kinds of preparations for Solomon to build the temple. And then Solomon became king, and Solomon built the temple in the place that God had selected for his name to be honored. God wanted the temple to be a place where all the nations could come to worship him and be restored to relationship with him. This is the fulfillment of his promise. Through the seed of Abraham, God is determined to bless all the nations of the earth. Well, Solomon took this very seriously. He knew that building the temple was a task that had to be done with excellence because of the excellence of the God of Israel. So let's look at what he says. This is 2 Chronicles chapter 2, starting with verse 4. Solomon speaking, "Behold, I am about to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, and dedicate it to him for the burning of incense of sweet spices before him, and for the regular arrangement of the showbread, and for burnt offerings morning and evening, on the Sabbaths and on the new moons, and on the appointed feasts of the Lord our God, as ordained forever for Israel." So Solomon is proving by saying all of this that he has read the law, he is familiar with the law and its requirements, and he has every intention of fulfilling the commands and the ordinances and the statutes of the law by building this place for God's name to be honored so that sacrifices can be offered in accordance with God's requirements in the place that God has selected. He goes on, verse 5, "The house that I am to build will be great, for our God is greater than all gods." So Solomon knew that the temple was the representation of God's majesty and supremacy in the sight of all the peoples of the earth. When the nations came to worship the God of Israel, the temple had to be majestic so that the people would be impressed and know that the God of Israel is the Most High and the most wonderful God, maker of heaven and earth. Well, Solomon also, when the temple was built and Solomon dedicated the temple, Solomon understood that the purpose of the temple was also to ask God to adjudicate justice among his people, Israel. God's purpose was to bring the fear of the Lord and the appreciation of the Lord from all the nations of the earth by demonstrating righteousness and justice through his people, Israel. So Solomon prays that for the people of Israel, even as he dedicates the temple. So Solomon's prayer of the dedication of the temple can be found in 2 Chronicles chapter 6 and in 1 Kings chapter 8. So we're going to pick a couple of scriptures from these passages, but you can also read the whole chapters for yourself. There's very little discrepancy between the two chapters, but here and there, there's a slightly different phrasing of how Solomon prayed and dedicated the temple. They're mostly identical, but you can read those two chapters to hear the heart of Solomon as he dedicates the temple of God to the Lord and to the purposes of the Lord. So this is 2 Chronicles chapter 6, starting with verse 22. Solomon is praying, and he says, "If a man," now he's speaking about the people of Israel, "if a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath and comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear from heaven and act and judge your servants, repaying the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness." Now, there are other verses in the context of the law throughout the book of Deuteronomy and other places where God says, "Purge evil from Israel," so that the people fear the Lord and will not commit that evil again. So Solomon is saying, when people come before you and they testify falsely, they're bringing a false accusation, or they make an oath swearing that they did something or swearing that they didn't do something, Solomon is saying, you know all things. judge, and repay the guilty with guilt, and vindicate the righteous, so that the bloodshed of the innocent will not happen in the land of Israel, and that perfect righteousness can be executed. This is part of the witness of the people of God to the rest of the nations of the earth. He continues, we're jumping down to verse 28. If there is famine in the land, if there is pestilence or blight or mildew or locust or caterpillar, if their enemies besiege them in the land at their gates, whatever plague, whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever plea is made by any man or by all your people Israel, each knowing his own affliction and his own sorrow, and stretching out his hands toward this house, then hear from heaven your dwelling place and forgive. So Solomon is saying, yes, we understand we're not a perfect people, and there might be things that come upon us like this, but as we stretch our hands out to you, Solomon, even by saying, your house where you dwell is in heaven. We know that a temple on earth cannot hold you. You are the God who created heaven and earth and everything in it. You have chosen this place to be your dwelling place. When we stretch out our hands toward this place that you have given us, please have mercy on us and forgive. But he goes on and repeats his request for justice among the people of God. He says, and render to each whose heart you know, according to all his ways, for you only know the hearts of the children of mankind. So Solomon understands that God knows the heart. God is not looking on the outside. God is looking at the heart, and God knows the truth of all situations, and he knows every lie that everyone has ever told, even when they take an oath about it one way or the other. God knows, and Solomon is saying, you know the hearts of all mankind. And he's saying, judge and render justice, we're up to verse 31, so that they fear you and walk in your ways all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. Solomon knew that the justice of God among his people was one of the ways that God's glory was going to be revealed to the rest of the nation. Well, his prayer continues. He now also includes a prayer for the foreigners. So when foreigners come from a foreign land, Solomon has a prayer for them as well. Solomon's prayer is, whatever they ask, give it to them. Give it to them so that they know that the God of Israel is the Most High God. This is now 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 32. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for the sake of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. So the foreigners are coming because they've heard of the greatness of the God of Israel. That's God's design. So Solomon prays, when he comes and prays toward this house, the temple, hear from heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you. So he's saying, whatever they pray, answer it. Whatever they ask for, give it to them. Whatever they say in their prayer, answer their prayer. Why? Solomon goes on, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. So Solomon knew the whole purpose of this. Answer the foreigner. Let them know that the God of Israel is the Most High God, so that they fear you and worship you, so that they can come into fellowship and relationship and covenant with the God who created them. That was God's design, and Solomon knew it. That's why he prayed this way. And in the First Kings version of Solomon's prayer, he wraps it up and closes it up just again to make the point abundantly clear. This is 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 59 to 60. Let these words of mine, he's saying, this prayer that I have just prayed, with which I have pleaded before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night. And may he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel as each day requires. Why? Verse 60, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and there is no other. Solomon got it. The purpose of building the temple was so that God's name would be exalted in the sight of all the nations, in all the peoples of all the earth. So Solomon understood the purpose of God, but Solomon, he also had some issues. Solomon's downfall was that he loved many foreign women and he built altars and temples to foreign gods. So at the same time that the God of Israel is being glorified and all the nations of the earth are coming to Jerusalem to worship the Most High God, the maker of heaven and earth, the God of the people of Israel, Solomon then starts building temples and places of worship for other gods. That is not a pure witness to the world. Imagine if you were a foreigner coming to worship the God of Israel because you had heard the stories about him. And then on the hill, just opposite the place where the temple is, well, you can go over there and worship any other god you like because in this city, all gods are accepted. That is not going to glorify the God of Israel. That is not giving him the glory that he deserves. But this happened in Solomon's life because he married so many foreign women. So let's look at the scripture pertaining to this. So 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 1 through 8. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after other gods." Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Shemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. So you see, God is trying to glorify himself through his people, show himself mighty in the sight of all nations. But now Solomon is marrying these foreign women, which strategically, from a military standpoint, it looks like a good idea. You can have peace if you marry with other nations, and then other nations, if they're the father of the daughter who you're married to, well, they don't want to go to war with you and kill their own daughter. But that's the way the world does things. God wanted a pure people, and a people who, when foreigners would come, they would worship the God of Israel as the only God, maker of heaven and earth. So Solomon doing this, it's not just that Solomon's heart turned away. It's that through Solomon's heart turning away as the leader of the people, now Solomon was leading people not only to the God of Israel, but it was compromised and mixed and blended out with the gods of the rest of the world. So God's purpose, again, even though it looked like it was about to be fulfilled by his people and through his people, again, it was polluted by disobedience and a heart that was not wholly true to him.